Hello and welcome to PressTv Spotlight. I'm Marzia Hashmi. Thanks so much for being with us. Sitting in front of giant LCD screens and pushing buttons, just like a video game, were American Special Forces, but their targets were very real and their lethal strikes caused the death of many in Syria, Afghanistan, and in Iraq. This is the findings published in a New York Times article exposing how this special unit would control drones or give orders for airstrikes, resulting in the deaths of thousands of civilians. All of this was done with no accountability and with the Pentagon even downplaying the murders. What does it all mean? Stay with us as we take a look at all of this on the Spotlight.
An investigation into the confidential documents of the U.S. military has laid bare horrifying facts about the American air war in West Asia. The New York Times says it has reviewed more than 1,300 records drawn from a hidden Pentagon archive, and all that has shed more light on how U.S. airstrikes have resulted in thousands of civilian deaths in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, but have gone mostly underreported. Based on the U.S. military's own count, air raids have killed some 1,600 civilians in these countries over the past years. And even though the Times does not give a figure, it does say that the military has drastically undercounted the tally. A particular case that's been highlighted is a 2016 attack on a hamlet in northern Syria that the U.S. military said killed 85 Daesh terrorists. But as it turned out later, the victims were in fact 120 farmers and villagers. The high number of civilian deaths also hints at the deeply flawed intelligence plaguing the U.S. bombing campaign, as well as the hasty and imprecise targeting that is in sharp contrast to precision bombs and eagle-eyed drones propagated by the U.S. military. It also brings into question the Pentagon's claims of transparency and accountability. Based on the report, only a few assessments of faulty raids have been made public, and surprisingly, none have found any wrongdoing or led to disciplinary action. A more recent example is the U.S. drone strike that took the lives of 10 members of an Afghan family, 7 of them children, in Kabul back in August. The Pentagon initially claimed that terrorists had been killed. Then it was forced to admit that the attack had been a tragic mistake, taking civilian lives. But eventually, it decided that no one would be punished for the erroneous strike. The New York Times says it has visited nearly 100 casualty sites in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan and interviewed scores of survivors to compile the report. Even though many civilian survivors now have to live with disabilities that require expensive treatment, only fewer than a dozen have received compensation. Despite such a terrible record, the U.S. keeps up with its air campaigns mostly in Muslim nations. Scott Bennett, a former U.S. Army officer, believes it is time the international community moved to stop the U.S. war machine from spilling more innocent blood.
When is the world going to stand up and stop allowing the U.S. to call every other nation a state sponsor of terrorism and say that the United States is indeed the state sponsor of terrorism globally because it is engaged in the destruction of the world? When is the world going to stand up and tell the truth?
The U.S. Army carried out more than 50,000 airstrikes in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan between 2014 and 2019. The aim was allegedly to eliminate militants and terrorists and bring peace and stability to those countries. But those bombardments brought nothing other than death and destruction. And the U.S. has kept killing civilians with impunity and without accountability.
I'd like to welcome my guest to the Spotlight. Out of Washington, D.C., Media Benjamin, co-founder of Coke Pink. And Richard Becker, anti-war activist from the Answer Coalition out of San Francisco. Medea and Richard, welcome to the program. I'm going to start it off in D.C. and Medea. I mean, we're talking about the killing of civilians, but in general, shouldn't this type of drone warfare be illegal? I mean, just shooting from the skies without individuals being tried, doesn't it make the U.S. military basically judge, jury, and executioner?
Absolutely. This is a kind of extrajudicial killing that the U.S. faults other countries for doing them, putting groups on terrorist lists for this kind of activity, perhaps less high tech than the Reaper and Predator drones that the U.S. uses. But this should be outlawed globally, just as the global community came together to outlaw other weapons that end up being used indiscriminately, like cluster bombs.
Richard, in your take, I mean, how has this drone warfare changed this whole dynamic of war, if you want to call it that? Because as Medea said, it just depends on how technologically advanced the country is as far as having drones. And basically, especially when we look at an entity like the United States, that it can have be over so many countries and controlling from the airways. I mean, how dangerous is this type of warfare, and how has it changed warfare in general?
Well, it's really robot killing, or killing by robots. And what the military is looking to do, and if you see military-oriented websites, it's very clear that this is what's happening, is that they're trying to extend the drone warfare, that kind of robotic warfare, into armor on the ground and soldiers, and robot soldiers. So this is something where the occupying power or the belligerent power doesn't have to risk the lives of its own soldiers, and that can cause wars to become unpopular, of course, when there are high death counts of their own soldiers. But it's it's so dangerous, it's so ominous and so terrible for the people who live under the threat, particularly of these drones. I mean, this has caused immense physical damage and psychological damage, particularly to children in many of these zones, and it includes other countries as well, like Pakistan, where the drones are there all the time, and the children hear the buzzing overhead, wondering, when does the strike come, and will I be the victim of the strike? I mean, all of this is really wrapped up in the criminality of occupation, which makes things like this kind of warfare and the targeting of civilians, whether intentional or not intentional, inevitable.
Right. Well, speaking of the targeting of civilians, I mean, the U.S., the Medea, carried out over 50,000 airstrikes between 2014 and 2019 in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq. I mean, that's an absolutely staggering number of airstrikes, and obviously the casualty figures are going to be high. It appears, as Richard had said, that this is more of a robotic form of warfare. It appears that these individuals that are sitting behind these LCD screens can become very, very detached from the reality on the ground, and that makes it even more lethal. Your take?
Absolutely. You have to add to this the racism that infuses these kinds of wars, so that people don't think of the Afghan people or the Iraqi or the Syrian people as whole human beings that are entitled to the same right to life as the rest of us. So yes, when you are so detached, you have very little ability to have some kind of empathy. Although I must say there is a lot of PTSD among the drone operators, because in some cases they do follow the family around for quite a while. And some of them have told us that they could see the father playing with his children, or people, the children in the fields, and then suddenly they are obliterated. But it does show the kind of lengths that the U.S. has gone to develop a weapon that would protect the U.S. military, the U.S. contractors, the U.S. CIA, all those involved in sending these lethal weapons thousands of miles away, and then killing people many, many times lying about what the strike actually accomplished and no accountability. So it is remarkable that it was the New York Times that actually went to visit these sites, because they said of 1,300 sites, quote, investigated by the Pentagon, and only one had they ever actually been to the site. They just used the video footage. So it's good this is being revealed, but the American people should go further and say, now that we know that so many civilians are killed in these strikes, we should outlaw this kind of drone warfare.
Well, Medea, you just mentioned that the New York Times actually went and investigated. What do you think happened? Because we haven't been seeing this type of investigative reporting recently coming out of the United States, whether we're talking about from 2003 dealing with Iraq, or we're talking previous to that with Afghanistan and other places. So what do you think brought this on, Medea?
Well, it's interesting when you compare the reporting that happened during the days of the Vietnam War, when we got so many reports directly from the battlefield, right, and people saw how gory war was, and it helped to turn people against the wars. I think there was a cutback in a lot of the budgets, a worry about liability for sending journalists into war zones, but perhaps even a concerted effort to make this war one in which it was, we didn't see the results, we didn't see the blood and the gore. And it's part of keeping these wars in the background. That's one of the reasons they were able to keep it going for 20 years without the American public rising up. And while the U.S. troops are out of Afghanistan, Biden has said he will keep the over-the-horizon ability to strike in Afghanistan, and the U.S. is still doing these kinds of things in Iraq and Syria and other places.
Richard, I mean, there seems definitely to be a detachment, what Medea was saying about the American people basically perhaps not having the information about what it means to be living in these areas, as you said, with this constant buzzing sound and every second just waiting to be attacked. And then when something happens, the Pentagon basically denies that any civilians have been killed. And fortunately, in this case, as Medea said, the New York Times has exposed it. But basically, the Pentagon usually denies it and tries to sweep it under the rug. I mean, what does it all mean? Does it mean that people's lives in this region less important for the U.S. military?
Yeah, they definitely are less important. As a matter of fact, I think that what was mentioned earlier, that Medea mentioned that, you know, they're not treated as whole human beings. This is what's communicated to the people in the United States. Whenever there's a war, whenever there's an occupation, in 1,000 different ways, overt and covert, you are led to believe that somehow, you're dealing with evil people. This is, you go back to George W. Bush and, the axis of evil. Well, that's, kind of a particular way of looking at the world, but it has nothing to do with reality and everything to do with propaganda and racism. And this is always true. In every imperialist war, and this goes for all of the countries, whether it was the French in Algeria or the Germans in Southwest Africa or the U.S. in the Philippines and Vietnam and all the more recent wars that we've seen, that the wars are always accompanied by racist campaigns to desensitize people here, to make them not think about the fact that, what is actually happening there. And the reporters, like in the two Iraq wars, both had to be embedded with the U.S. military. The Pentagon did pick that up from Vietnam, not to have people really showing what's going on in the battlefield, and in fact, the mass media preventing being shown the reality of what was taking place there. So this is, racism goes with occupation, and racism justifies mass murder. And what we see here now is the U.S. trying to put in prison for life Julian Assange, who, along with Chelsea Manning and others who have been in prison, exposed war crimes. So the war crimes are not treated by the government as crimes, but exposing war crimes gets you prosecuted.
Right, and it just continues to show the hypocrisy of it all, don't you think, Medea? And when we look at with the situation of these special units, that they didn't even have to answer traditionally to their superiors. They said that they were extremely aggressive and effective. And basically so effective that this is really interesting here. It says that even the CIA complained about the number of civilians that they killed. Now that's really something. I mean, your take on all of this, Medea, I mean, it's mind-boggling.
Yes, let's not forget Daniel Hale, a drone operator and analyst who is in prison right now for having said precisely that the majority of the strikes did not even hit their intended targets. So yes, when you have the CIA complaining that there are too many civilians being killed, you know something is totally off. And let's remember that people who order these strikes and kill civilians don't get in trouble for it. And that is why they were able to keep going for so long. I think that it is good that we get these reports now coming out, but we shouldn't have to. We should have, our government should be making this information available to the public. And if it were, I don't think we would have allowed it to go on for so long.
But, I mean, Medea, you say we shouldn't have to get these reports, that the government should be actually given these reports. The government was complicit, obviously, in this, in hiding the reality. So, Richard, let's start from there. Isn't that the basic problem, that the government officials do not necessarily represent what the American people want? Because I'm sure the majority of the American people are tired of war. I'm sure the American people would prefer to have money spent on their own infrastructure. However, as you have said, and Medea, that it's not reflected correctly in the media, the reality of what's going on. So how do we get from where we are to where we need to be, meaning that the people can pressure the government, that the people understand what's happening and can make a change in the policies coming out of D.C.?
Well, the foreign policy of the United States has nothing to do with the interest of the people of the United States, nor does it have anything to do with the interest of any people anywhere. These are the interests of empire and power and profit that are represented. And, you know, we've just gone through a whole month after month after month of a debate, and apparently it's come to a crashing halt about a bill before Congress needs. You know, cut back from $3.5 trillion to $1.75 trillion, and now gone altogether. But the military budget that was just passed by Congress, and you know, no big deal, $778 billion, and that's the Pentagon budget. That's not the whole military budget. So, you know, and we're told that we're in competition with other people in the world. We're in competition with China or Russia, but particularly China. No, we're not. Not the people of this country, but that's the propaganda. And it has to do with the interest of the ruling elite in this country to be the predominant power in the world. Why else would there be 800 military bases around the world? Whose interest does that serve? Not the people of those countries, and not the people of the United States either. So I think one thing that's clear is that it's not going to change until people inside the United States, in collaboration with our sisters and brothers around the world, rise up against this. That's the only thing that's going to change it. It's not going to change on its own.
Not going to change on its own, but in the meantime, Medea, I mean, we've just seen in August with the fiasco taking place in Afghanistan, and of course we saw another attack. It was supposed to be on a Daesh cell unit. Of course, at the end, it was an Afghan family who was killed. Again, no accountability. They were forced to admit that it had happened. But in the long run, nothing happens to these individuals, not the individuals who are responsible for it and not the ones who have given the orders for it. So when we talk about that there needs to be a change in the interim, though these people are living in this with this type of terror on a day-to-day basis, what needs to be done from this side of things, you think?
Yes, the issue of a lack of accountability is absolutely key. Those of us who are supporting the political prisoners like Daniel Hale and Julian Assange have been constantly pointing out that it's the people who expose the crimes who go to jail, not the people who commit the crimes. And Marcy, I think it's also important to point out that in the case of Afghanistan, after bombing that country for 20 years and losing to the Taliban, the U.S. is now taking out revenge by freezing over $9 billion of their assets and probably killing more people in the coming winter than were killed during these 20 years of war. So it's not just the bombs going off, it's the way that the U.S. acts like the king and tries to dictate to people, even to the extent of if they can or cannot have access to their own money.
Yeah, well, definitely. I'm sitting in a country that definitely we have witnessed that continuously. But so at the end of the day, I mean, because the way it is projected, again, to the American public, because we're talking about that it takes the Americans also to rise up, whether we're talking about, for example, Afghanistan right now, what they're hearing, perhaps reports coming from the UN and this humanitarian crisis that's about to take place, and perhaps even giving money to try to help to some human rights group or whatever. But the bottom line is that they don't understand the connection between this tragedy that's taking place and their own government. 20 years of that war and destruction, and now controlling their funds. So Richard, your take on that, because it seems that it all goes back to the mass media and the corporate media and getting the right message out, or not?
Well, you know, this is not something really new. The late and great Attorney General Ramsey Clark, for many, many years, was a lonely voice after the end of the Vietnam War in pointing out that the U.S. had maintained economically destructive sanctions on Vietnam after a war in which 3 to 4 million Vietnamese were killed and much of the country was laid waste. So this is what empire is about. It's not really different in terms of its willingness to use the most vicious methods than the Roman Empire or the British Empire or any of the other empires. They will do anything to maintain their position in the world and to suppress those who have rebelled against them. Any rebellion against the empire is regarded as a danger to the empire as a whole by the emperors, because if anyone can succeed, then many others who are oppressed and held down will think that they can succeed as well. So we have the U.S. pulling out of Afghanistan, freezing its funds, freezing the funds and sanctioning other countries, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea. It really is the most vicious policy because it injures most of all the most vulnerable in society.
And on that note, I appreciate both of you being with me for the Spotlight. Medea Benjamin, co-founder Code Pink out of Washington, D.C., and Richard Becker, anti-war activist from the Answer Coalition out of San Francisco. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another Spotlight. I'm Marzieh Hashemi, signing out for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Hope to see you right here next time. Goodbye.